Pay attention to this footage. Really look at it. This was captured on a helmet camera by rock climber Jake Morrison on the night of October 12th, during what was supposed to be a routine night hike through Hollow Ridge State Forest in northern Vermont. Watch the figure crouched in the underbrush. Notice the way it's positioned, like it's waiting. Look at those hands. Those aren't normal fingernails. And that face, that snout-like nose, the matted hair covering nearly every inch of skin. Jake didn't realize what he'd filmed until 3 days later when he reviewed his footage. By then, 2 more hikers had vanished. This creature, this thing that looks like it crawled out of a nightmare, was once a respected university professor named Dr. Leonard Whitaker. And over the course of 9 months, he would become responsible for one of the most disturbing crime sprees in Vermont's history. You know that feeling when you're hiking and you get this weird sense that something's watching you? That prickle on the back of your neck that makes you walk just a little bit faster? For 13 people in Vermont, that instinct was trying to save their lives. Hollow Ridge State Forest sits about 40 miles south of Burlington, Vermont. It's the kind of place that looks like it belongs on a postcard. Dense forests, winding trails, crystal clear streams cutting through ancient rock formations. People come from all over New England to hike there, especially in the fall when the leaves turn those brilliant shades of red and gold. The trails range from easy, family-friendly paths to challenging climbs that attract serious outdoor enthusiasts. In the spring of 2018, Hollow Ridge was a place where you'd see families with their kids, elderly couples with their walking sticks, college students looking for adventure. It was safe, familiar. The kind of place where the biggest danger was maybe twisting your ankle on a loose rock or getting caught in an unexpected rainstorm. But between April and December of that year, something changed. Something dark moved into those woods, and it was hunting. The thing is, nobody realized it at first. A missing hiker here and there wasn't exactly unheard of. People got lost, took wrong turns, occasionally got injured and couldn't call for help if they were out of cell range. The forest was massive, over 40,000 acres of wilderness. Search and rescue teams would go out, do their sweeps, and sometimes people would turn up disoriented but alive. Other times, sadly, they'd find a body. Accidents happened. But this wasn't accidents. This was something else entirely. The first person to vanish was 28-year-old Rebecca Torres. She was a veterinary technician from Burlington who loved solo hiking. On April 14, 2018, Rebecca told her roommate she was heading to Hollow Ridge for a day hike on the Cascade Trail, a moderate 6-mile loop that was one of her favorites. She'd done it dozens of times. She packed her usual gear, water, energy bars, her phone, a first aid kit. She left around 8 in the morning, saying she'd be back by dinner. Dinner came and went. Midnight passed. By sunrise the next morning, her roommate called the police. Park rangers found Rebecca's car still in the trailhead parking lot. Her hiking boots, her spare pair, were in the trunk. Inside the car, her wallet sat in the cup holder. That was the first red flag. Rebecca had taken her phone but left her wallet, which meant she'd intended to come back the same day. A search team mobilized within hours. What they found 3 days later made absolutely no sense. Rebecca's backpack was discovered about 4 miles into the trail, just off the main path near a cluster of boulders. The pack was partially hidden under some leaves and branches, like someone had tried to conceal it. Inside, her phone was dead, her water bottles were empty, and her granola bars were gone. But here's what haunted everyone. Her ID and credit cards were scattered on the ground around the bag. Not stolen, just scattered, like someone had gone through her belongings and tossed everything aside. There was no sign of Rebecca herself. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no clothing, nothing. The search continued for 2 weeks. Hundreds of volunteers combed through the forest, calling her name, checking every ravine and cave system. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew overhead. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Nothing. Rebecca Torres had simply vanished into the forest like she'd never existed at all. The investigation went in circles. Police looked into her personal life. Was she running from something? Having problems at work? relationship issues? But everyone who knew Rebecca said the same thing. She was happy, stable, loved her job, loved her life. She wasn't the type to just disappear. Theories ranged from animal attack to falling into one of the forest's many hidden ravines to foul play. But without a body or any evidence, there was nothing to pursue. The case went cold. Then, on May 9th, it happened again. 34-year-old David Russo and his girlfriend, 29-year-old Amanda Chen, drove up from Boston for a weekend camping trip. They set up their tent at one of the designated campsites near Echo Lake, about 8 miles from where Rebecca had disappeared. David was a software engineer. Amanda worked in marketing. They were planning to hike the Ridgeline Trail the next day, watch the sunset from Summit Point, and then head back to Boston on Sunday. Saturday evening, they checked in with the park ranger station and told the ranger on duty, a guy named Phil Morrison, that they were planning an early morning hike. Phil remembered them clearly. He said they seemed excited, maybe a little nervous because the Ridgeline Trail was challenging, but they had good gear and seemed prepared. Sunday afternoon, when they didn't check out, Phil drove up to their campsite. The tent was still there, their car was still there, but David and Amanda, gone. Here's what made Phil's skin crawl. Their camping equipment was all set up perfectly. The tent was zipped shut. Their sleeping bags were laid out inside. Their cooler was closed with food still in it. Coffee supplies sat next to their portable camping stove. It looked like they'd just stepped away for a minute and planned to come right back, but they never did. On Monday morning, search teams found David's hiking boot. Just one boot, stuck in the mud near a stream about 3 miles from their campsite. The laces were still tied. Amanda's jacket was discovered later that day, torn and muddy, hanging from a tree branch half a mile in the opposite direction. And here's what terrified investigators. On the jacket, they found long, coarse black hairs that didn't match any animal species in their database. The hairs were human in origin. The DNA confirmed it, but the texture was wrong. Too thick, too coarse, almost like animal fur, but not quite. One searcher later said he found scratch marks on a tree near where they discovered the jacket, deep gouges in the bark about 7 feet high. The scratches looked like they'd been made by something with long, thick nails, something strong enough to tear through bark like it was paper. The FBI got involved. 2 missing persons cases in 1 month, both from the same forest, both with similar strange circumstances. Abandoned belongings, no bodies, no clear evidence of what happened. Special Agent Victoria Reeves took lead on the case. She was a veteran investigator who'd worked dozens of missing persons cases, but she later said there was something about Hollow Ridge that felt fundamentally wrong. It was like the forest was swallowing people, she said in an interview years later. We had dogs, we had helicopters, we had the best search and rescue teams in New England out there. We should have found something, bodies, at minimum, but it was like these people just evaporated. June passed without incident. July came and everyone started to relax a little. Maybe it had been a horrible coincidence. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation they just hadn't found yet. Then, on August 3rd, 3 more hikers vanished in a single night. College students Tyler Brooks, Emma Hartley, and Jason DeMarco were juniors at the University of Vermont. They'd decided to do an overnight backpacking trip on the Northern Loop Trail. They were experienced hikers, and they'd filed their route plan with the ranger station. They had GPS devices, satellite phones, the works. They checked in via satellite phone on August 3rd at 6:47 p.m., confirming they'd set up camp at the designated spot along Miller Creek. That was the last anyone heard from them. When they didn't check in the next morning, rangers immediately went to their last known location. The campsite was destroyed. I don't mean messy, I mean destroyed. The tents were shredded, gear was scattered everywhere, and one of the backpacks had been ripped completely open, the contents strewn across a 50-foot radius. There was a small amount of blood on one of the sleeping bags, but not enough to indicate a serious injury. And there were those same coarse black hairs, dozens of them, all over the campsite. The satellite phone was found in the creek, smashed like someone had taken a rock to it. The GPS devices were missing entirely. Tyler, Emma, and Jason were never seen again. Panic hit Hollow Ridge State Forest like a tidal wave. The media descended on the small Vermont town of Millbrook, which sat at the forest's edge. Headlines screamed about a serial killer loose in the woods. Theories flew everywhere. Was it a cult? A deranged hermit? Some kind of predatory animal that had wandered down from Canada? Governor's office got involved. The state police set up a command center. The forest was officially closed to the public on August 10, 2018, something that had never happened in its 100-year history. Agent Reeves assembled a task force that included state police, FBI, forest rangers, wildlife experts, and forensic specialists. They started by analyzing those mysterious black hairs. The lab results came back and they were baffling. The hair follicles were definitely human, but the keratin structure was abnormal. It was like the hair had been subjected to some kind of chemical or hormonal treatment that altered its basic composition. One forensic specialist said it reminded her of hair from someone undergoing aggressive chemotherapy or hormone therapy, except the changes were even more extreme. They started looking for patterns. All the disappearances had happened during new moon phases, when the nights were darkest. All of them occurred on trails in the northern section of the forest, and all of the victims had been relatively isolated when they vanished, either hiking alone or in small groups far from other people. Wildlife experts examined the scratch marks found on trees and rocks throughout the area. They weren't from bears or mountain lions. The spacing of the marks suggested something with 5 digits, like human hands, but the depth and width indicated nails or claws much longer and stronger than normal human fingernails. One ranger, a guy named Tom Sheffield who'd worked in Hollow Ridge for 20 years, said something in a task force meeting that made everyone go quiet. He said, "I grew up hearing old stories about these woods, local legends about something that lived out here. We always thought they were just campfire tales to scare kids, but what if there's something to them?" The legends talked about a creature that was neither man nor beast, something that stalked the forest during the darkest nights. Most people dismissed it as folklore, the kind of story every forest has. But now, with 8 people missing and evidence that made no logical sense, some investigators started wondering if there was a kernel of truth buried in those old tales. September brought more disappearances. A married couple in their 50s, Thomas and Linda Graves, vanished while birdwatching on September 17th. Their binoculars were found hanging from a tree branch, covered in those same coarse hairs. 2 weeks later, a solo hiker named Patrick Kennedy disappeared. His camera was recovered, but the memory card was missing. The task force was desperate. They set up motion-activated trail cameras throughout the northern section of the forest. Over 300 cameras in total. They had drones doing regular flyovers. They stationed undercover rangers on the trails, armed and ready. But the thing hunting in those woods was smart. Really smart. It avoided the cameras, stuck to areas with dense canopy cover that blocked the drones, and never approached the rangers. On October 8th, Agent Reeves got a call that changed everything. Remember Jake Morrison, the rock climber from the pre-intro? He walked into the FBI field office in Burlington with his laptop and said he thought he'd filmed something weird while night hiking 5 days earlier. Reeves sat down with him and watched the footage. Jake had been wearing a helmet camera with a night vision attachment, filming his climb down from Summit Point. At the 23-minute mark of the footage, the camera panned across a section of forest floor about 30 feet away. And there it was. The figure was crouched low, partially hidden behind underbrush, but the night vision camera captured it clearly. It looked human in its basic shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. But the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the fingers extended by what looked like thick, yellowed nails several inches long. The face was the worst part. The nose had somehow collapsed and reformed into a snout-like protrusion, giving it an almost pig-like appearance. Long, matted hair covered most of its body, and the eyes. The eyes reflected the camera's infrared light like an animal's eyes. It was watching Jake, stalking him. If he'd stopped walking, if he'd taken a break right there, who knows what would have happened. Jake said he'd felt uneasy that whole night, like something was following him, but he'd convinced himself it was just his imagination. When he finally reviewed the footage 3 days later, he nearly threw up. The FBI forensics team analyzed every frame of that video. They measured proportions, analyzed the movement patterns, enhanced the image quality as much as possible, and they came to a conclusion that seemed impossible. Whatever that thing was, it had once been human. The basic skeletal structure was there, underneath the deformities. This wasn't a costume or a hoax. This was a person who had somehow transformed themselves into something monstrous. Agent Reeves started looking into missing persons cases in the area going back years. She was looking for someone who'd disappeared from the region and might have been living in the forest long term. Someone with scientific knowledge, maybe, who could have done this to themselves deliberately. On October 19th, she found him, Dr. Leonard Whitaker, 56 years old, former professor of neurology and biochemistry at Champlain University in Burlington. He'd been an expert in neurological disorders and hormone therapies. In March 2010, Leonard had been kayaking on Lake Champlain when his kayak capsized during a storm. The kayak was found, but Leonard's body never was. He was declared legally dead after the standard 7-year period. But here's what made Reeves's instincts scream. Leonard had been working on research into genetic modification and hormonal manipulation before his death. His colleagues said he'd become obsessed with something called clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric condition where people believe they're transforming into animals. He'd been collecting hormone samples from various animals, studying how they might affect human physiology. Some of his colleagues said he'd been acting strange in the months before his death, talking about transcending human limitations and evolutionary advancement. His office at the university had been cleared out after his death, but Reeves tracked down one of his former research assistants, a woman named Dr. Patricia Owens. She'd kept some of Leonard's research notes because she thought they might be valuable someday. When Reeves looked through those notes, the pieces started falling into place. Leonard had been conducting experiments on himself. He'd documented his theory that humans could be enhanced through careful application of animal hormones and surgical modification. He believed that by altering his body chemistry and physical structure, he could become something superior, stronger, faster, with enhanced senses. The notes show detailed plans for self-surgery, hormone injection protocols, even instructions for filing down teeth and reshaping facial cartilage. The last entry in his research notes was dated 2 days before his supposed death. "Tomorrow I begin. Society won't understand, so I must disappear. The forest will be my laboratory. In 8 years I will be unrecognizable, and I will be perfect." He'd faked his own death. He'd gone into Hollow Ridge State Forest and started transforming himself into a monster. Now they knew what they were dealing with, a brilliant scientist who'd spent 8 years living in the wilderness, conducting grotesque experiments on himself, and somewhere along the way, he'd started killing. But knowing who he was didn't make him any easier to catch. Agent Reeves and her task force developed a plan. They would use bait, a volunteer who would appear to be a lone hiker, but that hiker would be surrounded by an invisible net of armed personnel. They'd set up during the new moon on November 7th, the time when Leonard seemed most active. The volunteer was a 30-year-old park ranger named Alex Thornton. Alex was former military, trained in survival tactics, and despite the danger, he insisted on being the one to do it. He'd known Rebecca Torres, the first victim. They'd worked together on a trail cleanup project the year before. For Alex, this was personal. The task force spent 3 days setting up. They had snipers positioned in the trees with thermal scopes and night vision. Ground teams were hidden in camouflaged positions every 50 feet. Agent Reeves herself was stationed in a command post with real-time video feeds from multiple cameras. The entire operation involved over 60 personnel, all waiting for one monster to take the bait. Alex entered the forest alone on the evening of November 7th. He followed the Cascade Trail, the same trail where Rebecca had disappeared, pretending to set up a solo campsite near Boulder Creek. He moved slowly, deliberately, making himself look vulnerable. Every few minutes, he'd pause and check his phone, letting the light illuminate his position. Hours passed. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees and the sound of Alex's breathing over the comms. Then, at 11:34 p.m., one of the thermal cameras picked up movement. A figure was moving through the forest about 200 yards from Alex's position, staying low, moving from tree to tree. The thermal signature showed it was definitely humanoid, but the heat pattern was strange, cooler than a normal human, like the body's metabolism had changed somehow. Agent Reeves watched on the monitors as the figure circled Alex's camp, staying just outside the firelight. It moved with a disturbing combination of human intelligence and animal predation. It was studying Alex, looking for weaknesses, planning its approach. At 11:52 p.m., Alex stood up and walked toward the creek, turning his back to the forest. It was the signal. He was giving Leonard an opening. The figure rushed forward. Even on the thermal cameras, you could see how fast it moved, faster than any human should be able to move through dense forest in the dark. It covered 50 yards in seconds. Alex heard it coming and dove to the side just as Leonard burst from the tree line. The teams moved in immediately, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices shouting commands to get down, to freeze. Leonard Whitaker, or what was left of him, stood in the clearing, caught in a dozen flashlight beams. The transformation was even worse in person than it had been on Jake's video. His face was barely recognizable as human. The snout-like nose, the filed-down teeth, the thick yellow nails that extended 4 inches from his fingertips. His entire body was covered in matted, filthy hair that looked like it had been growing unchecked for years. He wore the remains of what might have once been clothing, but it was mostly rotted away. He didn't surrender. He didn't run. He stood there and let out a sound that nobody who heard it will ever forget, a high-pitched squeal that echoed through the forest, half-human scream and half-animal shriek. Then he charged. Tactical teams swarmed him. It took 8 officers to bring him down, and even then he fought with inhuman strength. He clawed at them with those nails, leaving deep scratches on their tactical gear. He bit one officer hard enough to puncture the protective vest. Finally, they got him in restraints, specialized cuffs that secured his hands in closed boxes so he couldn't use those nails as weapons. They'd caught him. After 8 months, 13 victims, and the most intensive manhunt in Vermont history, they had Leonard Whitaker in custody. But the horror wasn't over yet. The next day, search teams found Leonard's den. It was about 6 miles from where he'd been captured, hidden in a cave system that wasn't on any of the official forest maps. What they found inside made seasoned investigators physically ill. The cave had been transformed into a grotesque laboratory. There were makeshift shelves carved into the rock walls, holding dozens of glass jars filled with liquids, hormones he'd extracted from animals he'd trapped, chemicals he'd somehow synthesized from plants, things the lab couldn't even identify. There were crude surgical tools, clearly used for the self-modifications he'd performed on his own body. And there were journals, hundreds of pages documenting his transformation, his experiments, his philosophy. He'd written in detail about each of his victims. He called them genetic donors. He'd been systematically hunting people and harvesting their blood and tissue samples, trying to extract DNA that he could use to further modify himself. One journal entry, dated April 15, 2018, the day after Rebecca Torres vanished, read, "First successful harvest. Female, athletic build, excellent cardiovascular system. Extracted blood samples, tissue from major muscle groups. Subject did not survive extraction, but the samples are viable. Testing begins tomorrow." He'd kept detailed records of what he wanted from each victim. Rebecca's strong heart and lungs for endurance. David and Amanda's genetic markers for height and bone density. The college students for their youth and cellular regeneration potential. Thomas and Linda Graves for their age. He thought mature DNA might slow his cellular degradation. On and on. A meticulous catalog of horror. The deepest section of the cave held the remains. Investigators found skeletal remains of all 13 victims, carefully arranged and partially buried. Leonard had taken what he needed from each of them and then disposed of the bodies in his underground lair. One of the forensic technicians found something else that made Agent Reeves' blood run cold. A list titled Phase 2. It contained 23 more names. People who Leonard had been stalking, watching, planning to take next. Each name had detailed notes about their physical attributes and which genetic traits he wanted from them. Alex Thornton's name was on that list. So was Jake Morrison's. If they hadn't caught Leonard when they did, the killing would have continued for years. Remember that footage from Jake's helmet camera? During the investigation, forensic video analysts discovered something crucial. In the background of the video, barely visible, you could see markers that Leonard had made on the trees, scratches and symbols that he was using to track his hunting routes. When investigators cross-referenced these markers with the locations where victims had disappeared, they realized Leonard had been marking his territory like an animal, creating a map that only he could read. That evidence became critical in proving premeditation. Leonard hadn't just been killing randomly, he'd been carefully selecting victims, tracking them, studying them, and then striking when they were most vulnerable. The helmet cam footage that seemed like a lucky break was actually the key to understanding his entire hunting pattern. Leonard Whitaker never spoke a word during his trial. He couldn't. Whatever he'd done to himself had damaged his vocal cords beyond repair. He could only make those horrible squealing sounds. The court appointed a psychiatric team to evaluate him, and their report made for grim reading. Leonard had indeed been suffering from clinical lycanthropy, but he'd taken it to an unprecedented extreme. He genuinely believed he was creating a new species, something beyond human. He was found guilty, but criminally insane. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Leonard was sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security psychiatric facility. He's kept in a specialized containment cell with reinforced walls and around-the-clock monitoring. He requires 4-point restraints at all times because his nails continue to grow at an abnormal rate, about an inch per month. They have to sedate him to trim them. Prison psychiatrists say he's completely withdrawn into himself, lost in whatever twisted mental landscape he created over those 8 years in the forest. The families of his victims came together in the aftermath of the trial. Rebecca Torres's parents started a foundation to improve safety measures in state parks. David Russo's father lobbied successfully for legislation requiring all hikers to carry GPS beacons in certain high-risk areas. Amanda Chen's sister became a victims' rights advocate. Hollow Ridge State Forest reopened to the public in March 2019, but it's never been the same. Visitor numbers dropped by 60% that first year. The northern trails where Leonard hunted are now closed permanently. There's a memorial at the main ranger station with 13 names carved in stone, one for each victim who went into those woods and never came back. Agent Victoria Reeves retired from the FBI in 2021. She said the Whitaker case changed her, made her understand that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't supernatural or imaginary. Sometimes they're people who've deliberately turned themselves into something monstrous. Jake Morrison, the climber whose footage helped crack the case, moved away from Vermont. He told reporters he couldn't look at forests the same way anymore, couldn't shake the feeling that something might be watching from the shadows. As for Leonard Whitaker, he sits in his cell, trapped in the twisted form he created for himself, a living reminder that the line between human and monster is thinner than we'd like to believe. Leonard Whitaker was convicted on 13 counts of first-degree murder, 13 counts of kidnapping, 13 counts of improper disposal of human remains, unlawful possession of human tissue, practicing medicine without a license, and additional charges related to the desecration of human remains. He was sentenced to 13 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security psychiatric facility. The victims, Rebecca Torres, David Russo, Amanda Chen, Tyler Brooks, Emma Hartley, Jason DeMarco, Thomas and Linda Graves, Patrick Kennedy, and 4 others whose names were released later, are gone but not forgotten. Their families made sure of that. Every year on April 14th, the anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance, Volunteers gather at Hollow Ridge to walk the trails in remembrance of those who were lost. They carry lights, hundreds of them, turning the dark forest into something beautiful again. Because that's what the families wanted. Not for people to fear the woods where their loved ones died, but to remember that before Leonard Whitaker turned Hollow Ridge into his hunting ground, it was a place of beauty and peace. And maybe, in their own way, those 13 people are taking it back.